Greetings. Welcome to module number 6. This is for the week of uh, August the 3rd. So module 6 means we have 6, 7, and 8. So we're getting very close. We're two-thirds way through this course. So as I said in a recent announcement that you should submit to me a topic for your final term paper and a brief abstract and some of the literature that you will use for your research and will be reflected in your bibliography for your paper and in your footnotes or endnotes. So things are wrapping up quickly. If you're behind on any assignment, I strongly urge you to catch up on that. The longer you delay, sometimes these things back up and it gets more and more difficult to catch up. So please do your best. We are considering the topic of human rights for this module number 6 during the week of August 3rd. So I will go into my PowerPoint presentation here and share my screen. Okay. I think we're making a little progress here. I want to get the full screen up here and start from the beginning. Okay. Module 6, week of August 3rd, 2026 on human rights. The course is entitled Human Rights, Law and Government. These are photos from the United Nations here in Manhattan, on the east side of Manhattan, around on First Avenue. Sorry, at the intersection of 45th Street. HGI is at 34th Street and at 8th Avenue. So you can do the math and see how many blocks it is to walk from HGI to the UN. These are some links that you could look into. You can find the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on your website quite easily. You can also look up the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, learn about that, or the Human Rights Council are easy to access through a simple Google search or any search engine. So we're looking to develop an understanding of the historical development of the concept of human rights and the place of human rights within the UN framework, and understand the UN's efforts to, as stated in its charter, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, to the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. So this is from the charter drafted, as we discussed, in 1945 in San Francisco, while the World War II was still raging in the Pacific and in Europe, but a determination to begin preparing for the end of that war, a peace treaty, and the establishment of a new international organization that would improve upon the League of Nations. And the three pillars of this new organization would be human rights, peace and security, and development. Human rights, peace and security, and development, or today we would say sustainable development. When we look at the charter, we see human rights is mentioned 7 times in the UN Charter in Articles 1, 13, 55, 62, 68, and 76, and in the preamble, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. So it is referred to again here in Article 13, Article 55, 62, and 76. So it is a constant theme throughout the Charter and is mentioned one of the 3 pillars of the United Nations. And what is a right, a human right? A right is to have a legitimate claim to being treated a certain way by others. Either I have a right to receive something like a benefit, or I have a right not to be interfered with or not impeded in my own development or progress or way of life. If I own an item of property, then others have a duty not to steal or harm that property. If I buy a ticket to a concert, I have a right to attend. The concert organizers are obligated to honor my ticket and to provide a seat at the concert. A right is a human right if the only criterion or qualification for possessing that right is that I am a human being. For example, human beings have a right to life, liberty, and security of person. Sounds like the Declaration of Independence, but this is Article 3 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, equal protection under the law. Article 7, a right not to be subjected to arbitrary arrest. Article 9, simply because they are human beings. Okay. If we look more in the background of how human rights developed, we can go back couple of thousand years. One example is Cicero. We are born for justice, and that right to be treated fairly or justly is based not on an opinion, but upon universal aspects of nature, that it's rooted in the very nature of our existence, of the way the world has been built and constructed or created. And that's from the first century before the Common Era. Human rights were affirmed and asserted with the Magna Carta in 1215, when various lords in the Middle Ages appealed to the king to grant them certain rights and protections, which was a major breakthrough historically in the history of the development of human rights. John Locke in the 17th century spoke about the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. This was further developed at the time, later in the 17th century, with England's Bill of Rights of 1688 during the Glorious Revolution, and then in the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Independence, as we've read, 1776, and the Bill of Rights as amendments to the U.S. Constitution were ratified in 1791, 2 years after the Constitution was ratified in 1789, and spoke of unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 1779, at the time of the French Revolution, there was the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and the Emancipation Proclamation under Abraham Lincoln, who saw the Declaration of Independence as a great and historic document. He was an admirer of Thomas Jefferson, the primary drafter of that Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln was the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation to abolish slavery in the United States and fought a bloody civil war to back up that proclamation. Civil rights are to be understood as individual rights, such as the right to life. That means someone cannot take your life or impede your life, harm you. Liberty, you have freedom to act and think and speak as you like. Again, as long as you aren't harming the life or the rights of someone else. You have a right to privacy, to security, protection from discrimination, freedom of speech, religious freedom, press freedom, freedom of assembly, and of equal treatment. These are civil rights. Political rights, for example, are freedom of association, to come together, to form groups, the right to assemble, even to demonstrate, a right to vote, a right to a fair trial, a right to due process. These are civil and political rights, and there is a covenant on civil and political rights passed by the UN in 1966. These two categories of rights that in many ways prevent the government from interfering with your life, your liberty, your privacy, your security, your speech, your religious beliefs or practices, or the media, etc., and political rights to associate, assemble, vote, and be given due process. In contrast, the economic, social, and cultural rights are rights to receive things. So the economic, social, cultural rights are sometimes referred to as positive rights, and the civil and political as negative. Negative in the sense that they don't offer you something, they just prevent others, particularly the government, from interfering with your life. That you are free to start a business, you're free to raise livestock and sell the livestock to others, and you have the right to the profits from selling your livestock. Economic, social, cultural rights are, in a general sense, rights to receive something such as food, housing, education, health, social security, water and sanitation, right to work, language, religious practice. So I say down here, you have this concept of negative rights that are more liberty-oriented, positive rights are more equality-oriented in general. So the first generation of rights, as developed by the UN, were the so-called negative rights, and the second generation, more positive rights, and the third generation are sometimes referred to as more collective rights. So this is kind of an evolution in the understanding of rights, also represented in the kind of Cold War division between the free world, stressing liberty, and the communist or social world, emphasizing to a greater degree equality. To achieve equality through government enforcement means greater limitations on liberties. So the challenges to human rights is something called moral or cultural relativism that claims there are no universal natural rights, there are no universal values, there are no universal truths, and therefore there are no universal rights. Rights are simply constructed by, or we might say invented by, different societies. So some nations will say that, for example, the human rights regime that was developed by the UN was simply a tool of the Western powers to impose their values on other societies. So that's one of the challenges to claims to human rights, that if someone says, in my culture, a 60-year-old man can marry a 5-year-old girl, that the idea that no, a marriage should only be entered into by an adult. And they would say, no, that's simply your culture's view of those things, and my culture has a different view. So there's also the challenge of different political economic worldviews, as I said, kind of what we call liberal democracy or democratic capitalism, the free market system, versus socialism or social welfare, which prioritizes on the one hand liberty, on the other equality. Some religious worldviews reject aspects of the dominant Western secular views of human rights, and some traditional societies reject aspects of the dominant Western individualist view of human rights and see these human rights as simply constructions of Western civilization to impose on other civilization. On the other hand, many in the global South, the so-called third world countries, Asia, many embrace this idea of universal human rights. I'm just saying there are those that will claim there are no universal values, there are no universal norms, there are no universal human rights. We have seen in the United Nations struggling within its Human Rights Council, where you have nations that have been horrific in their non-effort to uphold the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, have been extreme violators of those rights, nevertheless sitting with a representative on the United Nations Human Rights Council. This has led some nations, such as the United Nations, to withdraw from the council, seeing it as a kind of a farce and making a mockery of the very idea of universal human rights. So these are some of the challenges faced. So if we look at the history, we have the Charter in 1945, the Universal Declaration in 48, the High Commissioner for Refugees was established in 50, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was passed by the General Assembly in 1966, and its sibling covenant is the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, also the same year, 1966. In 1965, Pope Paul VI spoke at the UN underscoring human rights, and Pope John Paul II in 1979, both strong advocates of human rights. The UN Declaration on Religious Intolerance and Discrimination Based Upon Religion and Belief was passed in 1981 as a resolution, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, Linguistic Minorities in 92. A UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was established by the UN in 1993. This is based in Geneva. And the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty in 2002. International Criminal Court was set up in 2002. It is a non-UN criminal court. And the Human Rights Council, which inherited from the Human Rights Commission, was set up in 2005. And this concept of R2P. R2P stands for responsibility to protect, that the UN or other regional authorities have the responsibility to protect those whose human rights are being violated by a sovereign state. And this came out of the era of the genocide in Rwanda and Burundi back in the 1990s, and where so many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people were slaughtered in a kind of an ethnic war. And other nations did not intervene to stop it because that would have violated the principle of national sovereignty. Sovereignty has some implication that mind your own business when it comes to our country's internal affairs. But there are certain points, the UN argued, where it is the responsibility of the UN or even other nations, or say the African Union in the case of Rwanda and Burundi, to intervene on behalf of those being killed. So R2P, responsibility to protect, meaning to protect those who are vulnerable, those who are being victimized, those who are in threat of being eliminated through genocidal practices, that it is a responsibility to intervene, to put aside the declared sovereignty of that nation that is hiding behind a shield of so-called sovereignty, to the devastating impact and effect of genocidal practices. So this is more about the responsibility to protect R2P or RTOP and how it came about to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. For example, in the Holocaust, 6 million Jews and others were killed by the Nazis, and some were aware that this was going on, but reluctant to intervene, either for fear that the Nazis would deal a crushing counterblow, or fear, oh, we should not violate the sovereignty of Germany at that time. So R2P is controversial because it represents overruling the principle of sovereignty in cases where there are mass atrocities going on. So Pillar 1 is the protection responsibilities of the state. Pillar 2, the international assistance and capacity building. And Pillar 3, the timely and decisive collective response to this intervention. So to protect means if there's a country that is at a horrific level violating, committing war crimes or genocide, ethnic cleansing of a people within a sovereign territory, that other countries have not only the right, but in this instance, the responsibility to intervene, to violate that principle of sovereignty because a higher order principle is being violated by the crimes being committed against humanity at a higher level. So there are many human rights NGOs at the UN, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a longtime important NGO in the United States, the Alliance for Defending Freedom, the Open Doors NGO, the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, that focus on human rights. Some of you may want to look into writing a paper about an NGO that is dedicated to human rights. Christianity, many argue, was foundational to the concept of human rights throughout its history. We've discussed natural law, that natural law advocates a universal capacity for reason to recognize not to harm other human beings, that they have rights, dignity, and integrity. In the Bible, it talks about human beings being created in the image of God, the imago Dei. So theologians for millennia, for centuries, have argued that human beings have a unique and distinct dignity resulting from being created by God. There were, and we've come across these before, looking at natural law and natural right theory. The Dominicans of the University of Salamanca in Spain, a very important figure was Bartolomeo de las Casas, who was concerned about the rights of indigenous peoples in the 15th, 16th century in the so-called New World, in the area of the Caribbean and Central America in particular, where he stood up for the rights of those indigenous people that the Spanish conquistadors were threatening and often mistreating in horrible ways. With the Reformation in the 16th century, reformers such as Martin Luther emphasized acting on one's conscience and of the importance of the freedom of the believer. So this gave rise to the sense that religious belief and worship practices are a right that cannot be controlled by some external power. So people like Martin Luther and even Henry VIII, Thomas More, John Calvin in Geneva led this effort, which impacted the pilgrims who came to the United States, to build a new Jerusalem, a city on a hill. In 1620, they arrived, and you had religious freedom blossoming in the United States and underscoring human rights. In the Catholic Church, in the Vatican, they had a council in the early 1960s, and one of the prominent documents was called The Dignity of Human Beings, Dignitatis Humanae, and it was a declaration on religious freedom. And this we see in the activities of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, of Desmond Tutu, and many religious activists working on behalf of the human rights of human beings. So again, there are many challenges on this issue of whether there are universal values or not, and disputes over what constitutes human rights, and the hypocrisy sometimes of nations that proclaim human rights but violate them in dramatic and terrible ways in their own governing of their sovereign territories. So religious freedom, I won't go into this now. We will look at this more closely in the last module, but you'll see that there are increasing government restrictions on religious freedom, according to the Pew Research Center, in all regions of the world virtually, strongly in the Middle East, where there's been a mass exodus of Christians from the Middle East. You can see here the decline in the presence of Christianity in Syria, Egypt, Palestine, Israel, Iraq, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. And the only exceptions are sometimes guest workers, like if you have 100,000 Filipinos working in your country, that would increase to some extent the number of believers, Christians who live in a certain country. So this is more data on this area. So there are many threats to the right to religious freedom. And as I said, we'll look at that a little more carefully. You can study these slides yourself if you're interested more in the religious freedom topic. And I think at least one of you have expressed interest in taking a look at this area of religious freedom. But I'm going to conclude this first lecture now. And again, on the religious freedom section of this PowerPoint, we're going to look at that more carefully in the final module number 8. And I'm going to close out this lecture, but I have another PowerPoint that I'm now going to record a lecture for that will be part 2 of 2 lectures for module number 6 on human rights. So stay tuned, and I'll, so to speak, see you again on lecture number 2 for module number 6. Thank you.